All right. This is going to be the module 1 is going to be about scaling laws and scaling analysis in engineered systems. So the goal of this module is to give you sort of a skill set in terms of how to analyze scaling in small systems. So one of the things that we talked about in the last module is that one of the small scale benefits is that we can exploit microscale physics. Physics is different at the smaller scale than it is at the large scale. We'll see some examples of that in this module. A lot of the BioMEMS devices, microfluidic devices, other microscale devices take advantage of the physics in order to do better sensing, more control, and so on, like we talked about in the last module. So I want to give you guys a general skill set on how to do this type of thing. Most of you, we've talked about this before, many of us are from different domains. Okay, there's some folks from civil, some folks from electrical, some folks from chemical, and so on. We as engineers often end up studying just a single domain and we become experts in that domain. Okay. This module is going to go a little bit differently. We're going to cover some of the basics of different engineering domains and look at scaling analysis in those different domains so that you can get an idea of the general procedure. A lot of times it's more important for you at this point in your careers as graduate students, you need to learn how to think at a higher level, at a different level. Okay, you may not know everything there is to know about microscale heat transfer, for example, for those of you who aren't from that field. But if you know some of the basics and you know how to do this general principle of scaling analysis, this can be applied to all different domains. Okay, you can make yourself an expert in microscale heat transfer if you have enough time to do it. And that, as graduate students, this is what you should be able to do. Even in fields that you don't know, you should be able to make yourselves knowledgeable about the area. So we'll talk about kind of in a broad sense how we can do that. So the overview of this module, we're going to start by talking about different length scales. We'll talk about the scaling of geometry and physical phenomena in different length scales. And we're going to talk about just some of the basic governing equations in the different domains. The electrical domain, the fluids domain, the thermal domain, and in the mechanics, rigid body mechanics domain. Just to give you a flavor for all of them. And what I want to show you is that the different domains actually have a lot of similarities between them. We'll talk about that. You know, the concepts of flow and forcing variables actually apply to both diffusion. It applies to the flow of current in electronics, the flow of heat, the flow of fluids in microfluidic devices. There's a lot of parallels between the different engineering domains. If you understand these parallels, I guarantee you, you'll become a very good engineer, a very good researcher. And you'll actually see the beauty of how nature works, that there's so much similarities between the different domains, which are essentially the different areas of nature. In doing this, we're going to also talk about examples of engineered systems which exploit the scaling laws at the microscale. So you can see specifically how you can take advantage of them. Now, one of the assignments that you will have that I will assign next time, but you can start thinking about it now, is that you are going to take select a microscale device from the literature, and I want you to analyze. You're going to analyze what the scaling benefits are for that device. I'll just jump ahead to this last slide here so you can see what your assignment will be. There's going to be two parts to the assignment, and we'll talk about more about this next time. Choose a physical phenomena or concept, preferably different than the ones we presented in this module, and prove its scaling. And the second thing is you're going to find a microscale device in the literature which exploits microscale physics, again, preferably different than the ones that were presented in this module. I want you to derive the scaling relations which give the device a benefit at the microscale. Okay. And we're going to talk about how to do this. So this gives you an idea of what we're going to actually be covering in this module. Okay, so let's go back up here. I'm referring to Albert Folk's slide again, some of the benefits of BioMEMS. We've seen this before. What we're focusing on here is the part about exploiting microscale physics. So we want to see, how does physics change at the microscale? So here we have the slide that you've probably seen before. Over here you have the larger scale devices, at least in the relatively. So these are devices on the centimeter scale, and then we're going down in a logarithmic fashion down to 10 to the negative 10 meters, where you have devices or things in nature that are in the 0.1 nanometer scale. This is a nice slide from the DOE office. So here on the centimeter scale we have the ant. This is already much smaller than we are. We're not even here on this map. Okay, getting down to from the millimeter scale into the micrometer scale, less than 1 millimeter, we have the human hair, which is 60 to 120 micrometers wide. So the diameter of your hair is around 100 microns. Red blood cells are about 7 to 8 microns, about a tenth. About a tenth of the diameter of your hair is the size of a red blood cell. These blood cells have to be small enough so that they can fit through your capillaries, which are about the same dimensions. Your blood vessels are much larger, but capillaries, the things where the cells are actually delivering nutrients to the cells, those vessels are actually not much larger than a red blood cell. Going down to the nanoscale, from the micro to the nanoscale, the next is we have the DNA. DNA is typically 2.5 nanometers in diameter. We touched a little bit on nanopores, I believe, in the first lecture. Nanopores are used to actually read DNA sequences. It's a technology, or it's being proposed to be able to read DNA sequences. So DNA is 2.5 nanometers in diameter, so it would be 1,000 times smaller. 1,000 times smaller than your red blood cells, actually 2,000 times smaller than your red blood cells. So we're getting down into very, very small scales right now. DNA is getting down to the molecular scale. The diameter of DNA is really the diameter of a couple molecules and a few bonds. Getting a little bit smaller than that, about half the size of that is the diameter of a carbon nanotube. Carbon nanotube is, some of you have, Pong, are you using that in your research? You mentioned?
Not me. In our lab, the other guy.
Who in the lab? Wen is using it for sensing, right? For doing, she's developing a neural implant?
Yes. Yeah, Nano is using the connector to do some neural probe.
Sensing. Yeah. So carbon nanotubes are, they're strings of carbon molecules that have been arranged in a sheet that rolls around like this. You can actually make carbon nanotubes using a process called chemical vapor deposition. Carbon nanotube has very interesting properties because the electrical conduction, the mobility of the rate at which electrons move through these devices is quite high. Carbon nanotubes conductive. So if you arrange a forest of those nanotubes, where a bunch of those nanotubes are arranged next to each other, and they parallel to each other, and they form kind of like a composite material, it's a conductive material, and with a very high surface area to volume ratio. Let me touch on that a little bit. Draw a little bit here. Okay, so we'll come back to this. Surface area to volume ratio. So let's say that you have a flat electrode like this. You want to make some sort of sensor. You have a metal sensor like this, okay? In a lot of these types of sensors, the electrochemical sensors, for example, the sensitivity of the sensor depends on the area, the surface area of your sensor. The larger the surface area, the more sensitive your sensor is. Why? Because let's say there's molecules in the solution like this. there's more area for the molecules to interact with your sensor. Okay. So one of the issues, if we're just taking regular electrodes and we make the regular electrodes smaller, the surface area of the sensor gets smaller, so the signal-to-noise ratio gets worse. So something that people do is they might take a piece of metal, same thing as before, except what they'll do is they'll put a whole bunch of nanotubes on the front here, like a forest. These things essentially look like you can think about it as a forest. You can think about it as a bunch of hairs sitting on top of the electrical device. You can do calculations and show just how much of a surface area to a volume ratio that you get. Just a huge increase. Okay, because now you have not only the surface area of the metal, but you also have the surface area of the sides. If you think of these guys as cylinders, you have the surface area and all the sides of it exposed to your solution. You'll see many examples of this in nature, where you have essentially you have hairs, right? Or small structures like this to increase the effective surface area to volume ratio of something. It makes there are many situations where more surface area makes the thing more sensitive. All right, coming back to this. Carbon nanotubes. And once we get to even smaller than carbon nanotubes, when we get to 0.07 nanometers, less than 1 nanometer, now we're on the scale of the atomic spacing between individual atoms. What you can see here on the left is a TEM image of the actual atoms in the lattice of a silicon crystal. Okay, so that's perceived as the limit in terms of how small we can go. Although now there's being discoveries of subatomic particles and being able to manipulate those, but making things much smaller than a single atom is, from the techniques that we know right now, is impossible. All right. So traditional manufacturing technologies can put us on the right side of the map here. Microfabrication techniques can work at the microscale. They can start interacting with microscale devices. And then nanofabrication technologies can actually bring us down here. There are ways that, Wayne State recently acquired a focused ion beam device that can allow us to make structures or holes and gaps on the order of even down to about 5 nanometers. So we can actually make things on this scale, okay, a little bit larger than DNA. Getting smaller than that is a little bit difficult right now, but it is possible to get sharp tips and things like this that are on the scale of like 1 to 2 nanometers as well. This scale we can use microfabrication techniques, and this is becoming well established. A lot of the microfluidics field is sort of in this microscale area, and some of the newer technologies are exploring the nanoscale right now. This is another slide which sort of, it's essentially the same thing, but this was also nice, so I thought I would put it up here. This is sort of comparing natural things that occur in nature on the left, again with sort of a size scale here, with things on the right which are man-made. And this is getting at what I was just mentioning, that we can make devices, of course using conventional techniques. We can make things on the millimeter scale. Using microfabrication techniques, we can make MEMS devices and such that are 10 to 100 micrometers in dimension. Moving down to the nanoscale, we can make, using special lithography techniques like interference lithography, we can get the dimensions down much smaller, down to about 30 nanometers, tens of nanometers. If we want to get devices that are 1 nanometer, 1 to 2 nanometers, we can use these things called carbon nanotubes, which I just mentioned. If you can look at this graph here, this is an example of a nanotube electrode. The gold-looking regions here are patterns of gold. Okay, so the dimensions here are a few micrometers here. But if you can see this just tiny Can everyone see these tiny lines between them, connecting them together? Hard to see here. You can see that better now? So these are nanotubes that have been strung between two gold electrodes. And they're studying the electronic properties of electron transport through those nanotubes. And they can use those nanotubes as sensors. People have even proposed using those as making transistors out of those. So that's one way that we can make devices that are down to the micrometer scale. On the left here, this is something that you didn't see on the previous slide, ATP synthase. This is a natural protein that occurs in the body. These proteins are on the membranes of cells. If we look at a cell as a big blob like this with a nucleus in the middle, there are certain types of proteins which are called membrane proteins, and these proteins span the cell membrane. So this here is the nucleus of the cell. This is where all the DNA is kept. This part is called the cytoplasm. And the boundary of the cell is called the cell membrane. And these things here are called membrane proteins. So interestingly, these membrane proteins actually regulate what goes in and out of the cell. The cell, you can think about it, it's a microenvironment. Inside the cytoplasm, there's a certain set of chemicals. The cell is a chemical factory, right? And on the cell membrane, there are these proteins, and these proteins can actually allow certain molecules to go back and forth. For example, sodium ions and potassium ions. It's regulated how those ions go back and forth. And this is what actually allows the cell to maintain a small potential across the membrane. The voltage on the inside of the cell is slightly different from the voltage outside of the cell. All right, so these ATP synthase is an example of a membrane protein. And this membrane protein actually is responsible for generating energy in the cell, but we're not going to get into that right now. But these types of proteins are around 10 nanometers in diameter, and these are the proteins that are actually being used for nanopore sequencing right now, or being explored for nanopore sequencing. At the smallest scale, there have been experiments that use these things called scanning tunneling microscopes to pick up and move individual atoms. This was a famous experiment that was done by IBM to show that I don't have a picture of it here, but IBM showed that they could take a few xenon atoms and spell out IBM by arranging those individual atoms. So we have shown the ability to make things out of individual atoms by lining them up. Of course, it's not scalable, or how useful it is still remains to be seen, but we do have the ability to work with even individual atoms. So micro-scale techniques, nanoscale techniques, then we have nanoscale nano devices, and then we have ways of actually manipulating individual atoms. I want to mention something called, there's these, what's called the top-down manufacturing techniques and the bottom-up manufacturing techniques. The top-down manufacturing techniques are the ones that I'm kind of talking about right now. We say that we want this part to go here, we want this part to go here, we want this structure to look like this. Okay, that's what's referred to top-down manufacturing techniques. We would go and design the shape of this gear in a CAD software, and we'd create a mask, and we use photolithography to make that device. We'll talk about photolithography later. All right, that's deterministic top-down manufacturing. The chemists use bottom-up manufacturing. Have any of you heard the term self-assembly? Self-assembled monolayers? So the chemist might use a technique where, and we'll talk about this as well. Let's say you have a surface. Like this, and like gold. There's a certain type of molecule that will, the molecule might look something like this. It has a part that attaches to the gold and the other half of it does not. So the molecule always lines up in one manner this way. So all the molecules are lined up like this. So when you basically put a solution of those molecules on, on a gold substrate, okay, they self-assemble on there. And then from here you can attach another type of molecule which might preferentially attach to this side, and then it will have a structure like this. I'm intentionally not going into the details of how it works. But what I want to show you is this is an example of what's called bottom-up manufacturing, where where essentially our chemists are using the principle of self-assembly to create structures this way. And there's a lot of examples of this in the literature over the last, well, I would say ever since chemistry's been around. So engineers often think of top-down manufacturing. Chemists often think of bottom-up. Another example of bottom-up manufacturing is that you could create a membrane. You could fabricate a membrane and then just put a whole bunch of membrane proteins into that solution, and the membrane proteins would actually get incorporated into the membrane on their own. With bottom-up manufacturing, it's a little bit harder to predict where things are going to go. The arrangement of things might be a little bit more random, but in a lot of situations it doesn't matter. Okay. For example, if you're trying to make a sensor, this is an example where if you assemble nanotubes on the top of a metal, you don't necessarily need to say this nanotube goes here, this nanotube goes here. You just need a whole bunch of them on there, right? So in those types of situations, the self-assembly, the concept of self-assembly is useful in nanomanufacturing. You could consider this a nanoscale device, because there are nanotubes and those have a nanoscale, right? But you are not doing top-down manufacturing in the sense where you're positioning every nanotube. Yes, what you're doing is you're saying that all the nanotubes, you can have it so that all the nanotubes only grow on the metal. So in that sense, it's somewhat deterministic. But you're not controlling each one. You're using the principle of self-assembly in this case. Questions? We'll get more into self-assembly later. All right. So now we're going to talk about scaling. Scaling of surface area and volume. All right. This will give you an idea of why we start to do things at the microscale and how you can take advantage of physics at the microscale. So we start with a basic shape, right? The basic shape has a length L. And so what I'd like you to do right now is find the surface area to volume ratio. So find the surface area of the cube, find the volume of the cube, and tell me what the ratio is. You can go ahead and do that in your notes. Suppose the side of the cube is length L. Calculate the surface area, calculate the volume, calculate the ratio. So what do we find? So what's the surface area?
L squared.
6L squared.
6L squared, right? That's the surface area. What's the volume?
L cubed.
L cubed, right? Surface area to volume ratio is 6 over L. That's right. Exactly. So, what does that mean? Let's go back here. All right, we have this cube. Surface area to volume ratio. The surface area so we will denote this SAV. Surface area divided by the volume. This has a side of length L. So we have 6L squared divided by L cubed. So it's 6 over L. This is the surface area to volume ratio. Okay. Now, the reason we care about this, I'll show you on the next slide, but it turns out some concepts, some phenomena in physics are dependent on surface area. Some concepts in physics are dependent on volume. Okay? So what happens then as we go to the small scale? What happens to the surface area to volume ratio as L gets small?
The ratio becomes big.
What's that?
As the ratio becomes big.
Yeah, exactly. So, if we were to make a plot of this, so this is L, and this is your surface area to volume ratio. Okay, let me rewrite that. Surface area to volume ratio. All right, this is going up. This is a 1 over L function, right? So it looks something like this. As you go to the small length scale, the surface area to volume ratio is going way up. Right? So things that are dependent on surface area will become more significant than things that are dependent on volume. This is a very important concept. This is where fundamentally where a lot of the physics, this is why physics changes at the microscale. All right, in general, volume scales as length cubed. Surface area scales as length squared. Surface area to volume scales as 1 over L. That number 6 that we came up with, that's just a constant, right? General scaling relation is 1 over L. This is what causes physics to change. So, looking at the scaling of forces. So, there are certain types of forces in physics, certain types of mechanisms that are volume forces. Okay, they're dependent on volume. Things like momentum, mass dependent, right? Mass scales as volume. Those types of things will scale as length cubed. All right, so we have this function y equals x cubed plotted here. Next to it, we have y equals x squared. A lot of surface forces in physics depend on the scale as a surface area. So they scale as y equals x squared. And then we have what's called lineal forces, which scales as y equals x. So you can think about x as the length scale, and then y is the magnitude of forces. The green line represents volume forces, things like momentum. Surface forces represents things like pressure, surface forces, and then the blue line represents line forces. So what do you notice here? At the macro scale, what do we notice? We see that the y equals x cubed function, it grows the fastest, right? So at the large scale, things that are volume dependent are going to be the most significant. Okay. Alice Meng's graph here that's in her textbook actually plots this in a log dimension, a log scale. The nice thing about plotting it in a log scale is that these curves actually become straight lines, and you can see a little bit more detail here. Okay, so what it's showing is that this y equals x cubed function, the volume forces, at the macro scale, these become very significant. When we get to intermediate scales, like at the micro scale, surface forces start to become most significant. This is from the meso to micro length scale. So we're talking about, from the millimeter scale down to the micrometer scale, roughly. It really depends on which types of physics you're talking about, but if we're just trying to make some general statements here. The surface forces start to become significant. Surface forces, things like pressure, friction, and so on. When we get down to the micro and down to the nano scale, then lineal forces start to become most significant. So physics changes as we go from the micro scale to the macro scale. This is all because of these mathematical functions. Lower order functions actually have a higher value at small scales. You can see that y equals x has a larger value than y equals x squared or y equals x cubed once you get down to small values. So what are some examples of these types of forces? These are mechanics examples because mechanics is a very intuitive domain to understand. An example of a lineal force. Let's start at the bottom. I think these are, start at the bottom because I think it's a little bit more intuitive to understand. Body forces act on a volume. Okay, things like momentum. Force equals mass times acceleration. Or the momentum of an object is equal to the mass times the velocity. P equals mv. So that's a force. Well, that's an example of something that scales with volume. A force, an example of a force, things like buoyancy or weight. Newtons per meter cubed. The more meter cubed I have, the more massive I am, the more force I have that's attracting me, that's pushing me down to the earth. So that's an example of buoyancy and weight. A body under the force of gravity. Okay. So notice the units here, newtons per meter cubed. Okay. So the more mass you have, the more body forces you have. Body forces act on a volume or a mass. Surface forces act on the surface of an object. Okay. So you imagine a pressure on the surface of something. So I'm pressing down on this thing here. So I'm pushing down. My force is distributed over the surface area of my hand, right? So that's called a surface distributed force. So in mathematical terms, you can see on the left here, surface force is a force that is integrated over an area. It's integrated over the surface of an object. If you have a cylinder immersed in water, the water is going to exert a hydrostatic pressure on that cylinder, right? When you take these ocean-going vessels and you go to the bottom of the ocean. Have you heard like James Cameron, the guy who started the movie Avatar? Has anyone seen Avatar? Famous movie, right? Well, the producer of that movie is also an explorer, and he recently went to one of the lowest depths in the ocean. He set a record. And they were talking about the ship, the vessel. His vessel had to be composed of a very, very strong material because the hydrostatic pressure that low in the ocean is just, the pressure is immense. So that's an example of a surface force, a pressure acting on the surface of an object. So the larger the object, the more the total force is. Right, pressure in a balloon, when you blow up a balloon, the pressure is acting on the surface, on the skin of the balloon. So examples of surface forces, pressure is one of them, and friction is another one. So when I'm taking my hand and I'm rubbing it against this thing, the more surface area my hand has, the more friction there's going to be, right? One of the very detrimental things that happens at the microscale, if you're trying to make objects that move, surface area is significant at the microscale. So anything that's negated by friction, you're going to have problems with that. Friction starts to become very significant at the microscale. Sometimes we want to take advantage of friction. That works great. But if we have devices that that actually degrade performance due to friction, then you don't want to have that. Now I'm ending with the lineal forces because these are, I would say, it's the least intuitive of the three. But there are such thing as line forces too. You know, the body forces scale as length cubed, surface forces scales as length squared, lineal forces scales as the length. Now an example of a lineal force would be if we have a cable under tension. Let's say you have just a line cable, and you know, and you have something hanging from it. So the force, you can see these force vectors here. The force is distributed over the length of the cable. So lineal forces are forces that are integrated along a line. If you want to find the total force on this cable, you have to integrate the force contributions of all these vectors, and you're going to integrate it along one dimension, the length of the line. If you want to find the total force on the cylinder down here, you have to integrate the force over the surface area of the object. If you want, for a body force, if you want to calculate the total buoyancy of this body under the force of gravity, you have to take the buoyancy force, the body force, and integrate that over the entire volume. So you do a three-dimensional integral on that. Right? You see how this works here? An example of lineal force besides the loading of a cable is surface tension. Okay, surface tension has a force newtons per meter. Okay, a lot of my research has been in surface tension, so I'm more familiar with that. Okay, these examples in mechanics are intuitive to understand, but these concepts extend to other domains as well. This is just a few other examples here. We'll go into more details as we go on in this chapter. So these are things that scale as the length. This scales as length squared, length cubed. So we've talked about dimensions. We have length here. Surface area scales as length squared. Volume scales as length cubed. A few examples of physical properties that scale as length cubed. Mass. Right? The mass of an object is its density times its volume. So that's something that will scale as length cubed. Heat capacity. Okay, for those of you, we'll talk about the thermal domain later, but the heat capacity of an object scales as its mass. The more massive something it is, the more energy it takes to heat it up or cool it down, right? So that's an example of the thermal domain of a physical property that scales as length cubed. And you can think of other ones as well. If we think in terms of physical forces, if we think about momentum, the force required to accelerate an object, force equals ma, Newton's law. Okay, we have mass in there, so that's what's called a body force. In the surface forces, we have pressure, newtons per meter squared, friction, shear force, newtons per meter squared. Electrostatic force also is newtons per meter squared. The electrostatic force is the attractive force between two plates of a capacitor. You put a positive voltage on one side, negative voltage on the other side, you get an attractive force, right? We'll be talking about that. Electrostatic force scales as length squared. Then we have lineal forces. Surface tension is one of them. So surface tension is something that has the units newtons per meter. This is not a force per se. The electric field is not a force per se, but we'll talk about examples where you can get very large electric fields because electric fields is volts per meter. Now again, if we take this capacitor example, I'm just going to draw this out here. So let's say we take a voltage source and we put it across a capacitor like this. Okay, from what you remember in physics, you get positive charge buildup on one side, and then you get negative charge buildup on the other side. Now, there's an electric field that develops here. Voltage is equal to the electric field times the distance. And there's also an attractive force here because you have positive charges on one side of the plate, negative charges on the other side of the plate. So there's actually an attractive force. And we're going to be talking about that later in the chapter. Now, the electric field, which is responsible for the force. Electric field is equal to V divided by D. So it's volts per centimeter. So we have a voltage source here. Let's say we have a 10-volt source, okay? Or 9-volt source, 9-volt battery, right? When we go to the microscale and this dimension here, this D becomes very small. Well, now your 9-volt battery can generate a very large electric field, right? Because we've scaled down the distance between the two electrodes. We actually, one of the big things that people have used with microelectromechanical systems is the fact that you can get large electric fields with relatively small voltages. Large electric fields means you can generate large forces. You can even cause these two plates to come together. Okay, microaccelerometers are based on this concept, by the way. And this stuff in your Fitbit, Nick, is based on these concepts. Then there's physical fluxes. Now I'm moving down to physical fluxes here. There are certain types of physical fluxes, and a lot of these fluxes scale as length squared, really. A flux is the movement of a molecule, the movement of a current, the movement through a magnetic flux, like through a surface. So generally these things are surface dependent. Heat flux, for example. All right, we're going to give the example of heat flux. The fact that you have in microscale devices, there's a lot of surface area for heat to move in and out. For that reason, if we compare, heat flux scales as length squared, heat capacity scales as length cubed. Heat capacity slows down the heating or cooling of an object. Heat flux increases the heating or cooling of an object. So at the microscale, you can heat things up and cool things down very rapidly. This is one of the advantages of it. Heat transfer at the microscale is efficient because you have a high surface area to volume ratio. You have a lot of surface fluxes. We're just about out of time here. Why don't we just do this one real quick? I think it's a good way to... let's just do this example real quick and then we'll end here. So a scaling example with gravity. So the question is, how does gravitational force scale? Assume the length of the object and the distance between them scale proportionally. So what I want you to do is do the same thing that we did earlier with the surface area to volume of the cube. For each one of these items, find out, does it scale as, we have G m1 m2 over d squared. This is the law of gravitation. So we figure out the units for each one of these guys, and then we can figure out how the force scales. So shall we do that real quick? Go ahead and try it. All right, any ideas? Do this together. What's the units per mass? What's the units per mass? Meters cubed. Okay. And units per mass again. Meter cubed. And then how about the denominator here? D squared is meter squared. Oops. Let me put this in terms of L. I think that's easier. So mass scales as length cubed. So we have two length cubes on top. The distance between them, so you have d squared, so that scales as length squared. This thing is not liking me very much. So the force is proportional to L cubed times L cubed divided by L squared. So this is proportional to L to the power of 4. Okay, this is a simple scaling analysis. So the gravitational force scales as length to the power of 4. This is why gravitational force, between Muhammad and I might not be very strong, but between two celestial bodies, it can be very significant. Right? So these types of simple scaling analyses are the basis for a lot of microscale devices and why they are useful. Okay? This is the kind of thing that you can think about doing. Find a device, do a simple scaling analysis on it. Sometimes the scaling can be more complex. Okay, and I just want to point out that all types of scaling analyses makes certain assumptions. Okay, this particular one assumed that both the objects are scaled down proportionally and the distance between them is also scaled down proportionally. Okay, suppose we said we're going to scale down the size of the objects, but we're not going to change the distance between them. In that case, the scaling changes, right? You're not going to have the L squared at the bottom because that's going to stay the same. In that case, the force between the objects is going to scale down as a factor of L to the 6th, not L to the 4th. Right? And a lot of times in the scaling analysis, we scale everything down proportionally. Everything scales down by the same amount. But in some cases, certain things might scale and other things may not scale. It depends on how the system is being built, how the system is being manufactured. Okay. So just keep that in mind. We're going to end there today. We'll start with another scaling example next time, and that's diffusion. All right. So I will see you all on Wednesday then.